In mission together we all join our hands. In mission together throughout many lands. With our hearts united, our voices we raise to God our Creator in glorious praise.
Hi there, welcome to Reflections, a program sponsored by the Paducah Cooperative Ministry. My name is Heidi Sir Heinrich, and I'm co-hosting today with Scott Dossett. Hi,
Good morning.
Scott.
How are you?
I'm good. It's good to be back with you today.
It is good.
Tell
And
us-
with our guests.
Okay, what's our focus today?
Today we're going to be talking, well, oftentimes PCM is an interdenominational organization, and so in the past we've often focused on different ministries and highlighting different local ministries. And we wanted to try to change it up a little bit and focus a little bit on maybe some conversation, since we are interdenominational, having some discussion and some dialogue with different folks. And so that's what we're going to do today. Our topic for today is what is evangelism, and evangelism being part of, I assume, most congregations and churches. And so what exactly is that? What does that mean? Evangelism, of course, comes from the Greek word euangelion for evangelism, and so it translates to good news. So what exactly to you guys is the gospel? Today our guests are Barry Roberts from Arcadia Methodist Church,
Yes.
and Charles Moore from First Baptist Paducah, and Megan Holland from Grace Episcopal. So let me take a few seconds to let you guys share a little bit about yourself. Barry?
I am a United Methodist minister. Second career. I didn't enter into the ministry until I was nearly 50. Quit my day job, went to seminary, was ordained, and serve at Arcadia now across the street from Paducah Middle School here in Paducah.
Wow, that's cool. Charles?
I've been in the ministry now, I can't believe it, 25 years, and served churches in North Carolina, Metro Chicago, California, Kentucky, and I'm enjoying ministry here. Went to law school and then seminary, so a little bit of an interesting background.
Okay, all right.
What part of North Carolina?
Raleigh-Durham.
Okay. Yeah. Megan?
I'm an Episcopal priest here in Paducah at Grace Episcopal Church, and I also serve St. Peter's of the Lakes in Gilbertsville, Kentucky. First career, obviously. Graduated seminary in 2011. Moved back here. I'm Paducah native, so I'm pleased to be serving congregations in this area.
Good.
Well, we appreciate y'all being here, and one of the things we want to look at is how does evangelism look from the viewpoint of a Methodist, a Baptist, and Episcopalian? Are they similar? Where are they different? And so,
And how can we celebrate all of that?
Yes.
Put that all together. So just briefly, maybe you can summarize, and we can talk. It's all about conversation. So maybe, Megan, if you'd like to start, what would you say, if you could summarize your idea of what the gospel means for an Episcopal or for yourself?
What the good news is?
Yes, what the good news is.
I think that the good news is the fact that God took apart the logic of life and death, took apart the mechanic of life and death, reached in and changed everything for all of time, for all of humanity, for all of the world, the universe, just because God loved us so much that he wanted to save us from any of that pain or death and destruction. It's good news.
That is good
It's
news.
good news.
That is good news.
great news.
Yeah.
Charles, how about you?
Would agree, it's the best news the world has ever heard. I think for me, I kind of lean heavily on 2 Corinthians 5:21, that God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, and in Christ now we become the righteousness of God. So nothing we can do on our own, all a gift of grace. Wonderful good news, since we tend to be such works-oriented people by nature, to hear that it's a free gift and freely given. Best news in the world.
Okay.
For me, the good news is that I can't mess up enough that God won't love me.
And that's
That
great
in the
news.
midst of all of the mistakes that I make, in the midst of all of the failures that I have had and will continue to have, there is a God who still continually calls me, says, come, walk with me.
That's interesting. I like that. I'm curious, because I know we come from slightly different backgrounds. If we look at the good news from the evangelical standpoint, tends to be based around the idea of atonement in that sense. Maybe from a different perspective, what specifically would you say the good news is? In the sense, what was Jesus proclaiming as the good news when he came onto the earth? Because it says that Jesus was proclaiming the good news too, so I just wonder what you guys would say that was. Maybe I'll start with Charles this time.
I think there has to be some bad news for the good news to be good news.
Okay.
And I think Jesus, for example, with the rich young ruler, had to deal with the bad news. And the bad news is when we look at ourselves in light of God's perfect law, we failed. Whichever commandment we want to pick, we've fallen short. So there has to be an awareness that we're in trouble. We have not measured up. We have not lived a perfect life, and God's standard hasn't changed, and yet He did it for us. He has done everything we need for righteousness for us. So I say it like this in the pulpit, you know, the good news actually makes, the bad news rather makes the good news the good news. And so we focus on both parts, hopefully landing and parking and living in the good news part. Because we want a church to be a church of grace, where we are, like my brother said, just recognizing every day how much we can't outdo God's grace by our own bad behavior. His love overwhelms us, and we want to live in that reality as a church family.
Okay. Anybody have a response to that one? Any thoughts?
I can add to it.
Okay.
I think also one of the things, the good news that Jesus was proclaiming while he was, in the midst of his ministry, was a sense of justice that is here but not here yet, kind of thing. The meek that shall inherit the earth.
Sure.
I think that is also good news, that even when things are not quite the kingdom of heaven, we can look forward and strive for the kingdom on earth.
That's good.
And yet at the same time, Jesus reminded those that would listen, the good news is at hand. You can experience heaven here on earth if you choose.
Sure.
And sometimes we want to look at the good news being something that's way in the future, rather than understand and grasp that God wants us to have the best of this life, the best of creation, here and now, if we choose. And it continually comes back to the decisions that we make.
Interesting.
So the
Really
good news is, I'm sorry, Megan, is God is here. God loves us no matter what. God forgives us. So as we said, that's great news.
Yeah, I was going to say, it really ties back in with the notion of grace that you were both talking about.
Right.
Was
But here's the
that
conundrum.
kingdom here on earth.
Why is that? Why are we not just whooping and hollering and everybody, grabbing hold of that good news and being overjoyed to hear it?
I think it's hard to receive grace in one sense because we tend to have somehow bought into the notion that we are to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and grace is not of us. It didn't originate with us. It doesn't come from us. It isn't about us in the sense that we do the work, and it's hard to simply receive something as wonderful as forgiveness. There tends to be in our human nature this thought that we can earn it or achieve it. I think it's
Or
hard
we don't
to,
deserve it, maybe.
or that we don't deserve it, and we
Absolutely.
don't.
It's
we
okay,
don't.
so you all deserve it, but I know how bad I am, so I know that God can't love me. Is that what we're seeing sometimes, that sense of
Absolutely.
I'm just not worthy. I'm not
Absolutely.
good enough. God can't possibly love me.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
What do we do with that then?
I think we talk a lot about who God is, His character and nature.
His mercy.
Yeah, He's a God of justice, but He's also a God of amazing grace. And somehow our finite minds might not be able to put all that together, but it's no conflict for Him. So we can just keep talking about how great He is.
I think what you said is a good question. Why is it that people aren't always responsive to that, though? Why is it that when I speak to people who are not of the Christian faith, that they don't always have the best response to the gospel? Is it because of a miscommunication of the gospel? Is it because of another barrier that is involved there? In your experience, I'm sure that you've come across people and had discussions with people who have troubles with that. Not just the desire to, or the inability to understand how God can love me, but there's seems to be more.
For me, as I look at our tradition and where I go back from seminary days, it seems that we find ourselves preaching one thing and responding in a different manner. That we hear the good news on Sunday morning that God loves us, that God has called us to go into the world and to change the world in which we know. And yet, to go from Sunday morning to Monday morning is a whole different venue. We find ourselves, if you will allow me, Heidi, to judge the people who come to PCM. You know, if they truly were wanting to do better, they would pick themselves up by their bootstraps, change the world in which they live. They would no longer need helping hands. And yet at the same time, Jesus told us that the poor is always going to be among us, and that we are to change the world, that we are to be the hands and feet of Christ, to make a difference in how we live our lives. It's not always the good works, but it's more leaning toward the fact that we do what Christ called us to do.
Christ loved us, and we're called then to turn around and
To share that.
not only
Right.
talk about it, but do something about it.
Exactly.
Sometimes actions speak louder than words.
And I think that's why we don't see people get excited. We find that a lot of Christians are very apathetic. It's easier to sit there on Sunday morning than to get up Monday morning and get your hands dirty.
I was thinking similarly, you know, evangelicals, we believe in a sin nature, and that's part of the reason we reject the gospel, but part of it is also, I think, our fault, the church's fault, because we've said we're a people of grace, and yet we have created religious communities that definitely give off the notion that you need to look like us and smell like us and act like us to be one of us. We say we preach grace and believe grace and live grace, but somehow the world has heard you must measure up to our standards and knock off our rules and regulations. And so we've projected a hypocrisy that we've said we don't like. And if they're going to be Pharisees today, you know, they're going to be in our churches, in our pews, and in our pulpits. So I think we own some of the responsibility for why grace isn't as welcome as we would want it to be.
So maybe the good news is grace, and good news for, maybe we have a tendency to see it as good news and grace for a certain group of people.
Unfortunately, I think we
But
do.
not always for everyone.
Right.
I think people carry people, including other Christians, carry around a lot of baggage of pain that has been inflicted upon them by, Christians.
Love.
I think that when you're sharing the good news, what you think is wonderful news, it can ring false to people, especially if we're not living out that grace in our day-to-day lives.
Here's a thought. A lot of folks, more than we realize, don't really understand what love is. Have not had the blessing and the good fortune to, thus far in their lives, really experience genuine love from their parents or wherever. So that may be kind of a foreign concept to some people, the love of God, which folks that have grown up in loving environments thinks, what could be better? But if a person has not had the experience of genuine giving love, then we're talking a foreign language sometimes.
The language of the Good Shepherd that would go anywhere and put himself between the wolf and the sheep.
Right.
If you've never experienced that in your life, if you've always been devoured by wolves, I mean, where do you draw from?
Or if, as you were saying, if we've experienced the opposite, maybe in places where we would expect to find it sometimes.
You expected a good shepherd and you find an ordinary shepherd, one that runs away.
Or a wolf.
Or a wolf.
That's true, that's true.
That's all good. I appreciate you guys responding to that. What is the ultimate goal of evangelism? What is the ultimate goal? Where are we moving with our view of the gospel and of the good news?
We want followers of Christ.
Followers
I kind of like that term. Followers of, disciples of Christ, those who hunger and thirst for His righteousness and live for Him. And we want to be those communities where grace abounds.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably the one concept that most churches are lacking, is that we are not creating disciples. We've got lots and lots of church members, but we're not sending out disciples on Sunday morning to go into the world to begin to change some of the injustice that we find in the midst of our society.
That's interesting. Okay.
I think part of why there are not as many followers of Christ on Monday morning, I think part of that is sometimes in churches we don't allow people to see where God is already working in their lives, where their vocations are, where God is already calling them. I think that we, as ministers and as other Christians, I think what we can do to help is point out, help open eyes as to where God is already working in your life and where your ministry is already happening,
like
and where
that.
you can do it intentionally.
So bring a sense of awareness.
Right.
Absolutely.
I always think of tearing down the wall between the secular and the sacred. I always try to tell the sheep at our church, if you're there, it just became sacred because you belong to Christ. So whatever He's called you to do today, it's a ministry. It's an opportunity to serve Him. It's a mission field. Do it for His glory. And I think that's really where a great work ethic comes from, that there is no menial task. This is as unto Christ.
Right.
And it becomes exciting.
But I think too, playing off of what they just said, is that we don't share among ourselves where God is working in our own lives on a day-to-day basis, either in small groups or even within the context of the church. That sometimes we need to be reminded that God is still at work in the midst of our own lives.
Right,
When
right.
we've had a bad week,
Right.
when things have not gone the way we had anticipated, or the snowstorm comes, or the floods overflow, and we suddenly find ourselves drowning in the midst of day-to-day life.
Right. Or it feels like a job instead of a calling.
Oh.
Yes. And I think
And
that's
many
where as
days.
churches we could really help each other recapture that vision of ministry for what it is, the exciting opportunity that it is, instead of the routine task or burden that it can feel like. And I think instead sometimes we shrink back into territorialism, and I don't want to admit that I'm flawed and human like everybody else, and we have weaknesses like every other congregation. We've got to put up a good front here, but we should probably be more real and build each other up.
I think
Does that
that's
answer
a
the
really
question?
good point. Sometimes for me, it's much easier to see how God is working in somebody else's life than it is to see what He's doing in my life. You know, sometimes I just can't see it, it's too close, but I sure can see it in somebody else's life. And our job sometimes is to point that out, to hold up the mirror and say, well, look what God is doing for
Right.
you. And then you hope that somebody will see that same thing in you and say,
Right.
well, I do see what God is doing in your life as well.
Right.
You know, because sometimes we can't see, but for ourselves, we can. But
That's
we can
right.
see in
And
somebody
you hope
else's
nobody
life.
says, I don't see him doing anything. You were going to ask a question?
Oh, I was just going to say we sort of got a little bit off of the topic of your question of what the goal.
What is the goal? Sometimes I hear evangelism spoken of in terms of conversion or a better world, mission in the sense of accomplishing something good. And so you're all very great at portraying a very holistic view of the gospel. I like that. But what would you say? Is there a particular goal that we're moving toward that is more than any of the others? Or would you say just yes across the board?
I would say just yes across the
Okay.
board. Oh, I just tapped my mic. Sorry. I think that it's difficult to say and know where Christ is moving in people's lives and how they're being changed and formed. And I think part of where non-Christians can get turned off by this message is when we do have a specific goal. When we say, all right, you're liking this message? Okay, now come to church and sign the
This is what
membership
it looks like,
book
this
and
box.
make your pledge. I think that's where people can start to feel alarmed, and rightly so.
Maybe even entrapped, really.
A little bit. So I would like to think that the good news is creating an environment where God can just start working in their lives, and that might mean something different to different people.
Sure.
And it seems like there's a stirring kind of the Spirit toward a well-rounded gospel that doesn't just focus on heaven, but that focuses on Christ's kingdom here. And I think about the passions of our own church family for things like human trafficking and areas that would have maybe in another generation felt like social issues. And yet we now see loving those causes as no compromise of the gospel, but as in fact a living out of the gospel.
Sure.
And like you said, the hands and feet, I like that. We talk about Christ's head and heart and hands and feet, and we want to be all that.
So does the gospel change in different contexts? Does it change? Would you say that the gospel is different to a child who is in a hopeless situation than it would be to a person who is looking to promote goodness in the world? Would you say, I mean, what does the gospel change to certain people, to a person in Zimbabwe versus a person in the United States? Does it change?
I'd say the gospel content doesn't change, but our delivery of it, our presentation of it, how we might wrap it, the language we might use would definitely, that's why so many times I'm praying under my breath, eyes wide open, Lord, help me in this conversation. I'm way over my head, I recognize that, because I don't know where they've come from. I don't know what hurts they've experienced. So help me say this in a way, God, that they can receive it into their hearts.
That's an important point. I think that in times, past histories, evangelism, the process of sharing the good news, has not always been done well. It has not always been done inviting the Spirit of God to be in front, you know. Talk about some ways that you have experienced or witnessed evangelism done poorly or even harmfully. Can you think of some examples?
I can think of personal examples.
Okay.
I was a waitress in college, and it was a really rewarding job. I find it easy to talk to people, so I was maybe not the best waitress, but I could chat everybody up pretty well. And I frequently had tables of people that would question me, or dare I say, interrogate me about my religion, whether or not I had been saved. As an Episcopalian, that's not language that we often use. So I would have really intense confrontations with people that I was trying to serve, and ultimately it didn't develop into a relationship at all. It was not that. And instead of tips, I would get like brochures for churches.
Yeah.
That more alienated you
It
than
was.
intrigued
It was-
you
it
and
was-
drew you in.
It was very alienating. Now, and on the same side of the coin, I served tables that were really interested and engaged and wanted to know more about me as a person. And I think that was evangelism done right.
So if you leave a Bible tract, you better leave an extra big tip. I think that's something
Love in
well.
action.
Your waitress,
right?
your waitress would thank you for sure.
I would say anytime we try to share the gospel in a way that isn't overly humble, we're messing up for the very reason that she felt on the defensive in the conversation, maybe unnecessarily. We need to be so careful that we're, I've heard it said, one beggar telling another beggar where bread can be found, instead of, let me tell you what's wrong with you.
Oh, I love that.
I'd rather say what's wrong with us and what's right with God.
Sure. We don't have much time left, but did you want to respond to that one as well?
I think for me, to be able to experience God in the midst of the world happened when I was in seminary. Of seeing God in action at local grocery stores or at pharmacies or whatever. I can remember one time there were a couple of us running in to grab some candy to take back to class, and there was a lady out front who was begging to buy diapers for a granddaughter. She wasn't asking for money, she was asking for diapers. So as we went in to buy candy, one of the guys that I was with said, why don't we buy some diapers and formula? And the three of us or four of us that were there suddenly was beginning to fill the shopping cart. And we bought diapers and wipe-ums and stuff. And it wasn't much,
Right.
a few dollars, but we went out, we gave it to the lady. She was more than appreciative.
Sure.
And she said, why did you do this? And we explained that we were in seminary and this is what God calls us to do.
Sure. So the good news is providing for people's needs and showing God's love at the same time, trusting in what He has said, but also acting as He acted. So it looks like we're running out of time. So thank you guys for being on today. It's
Thank
been
you.
wonderful. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Barry. And look forward to more discussions like this.
Yes, thank you. I wish we had more time because it's been really inspiring and lifting up. And at PCM, our mission is to do God's work with human hands. And I think that's what I'm hearing in this conversation, is that we're all out to do what we can to share the love of God. So
Maybe we need to do a part 2.
maybe.
Maybe.
Thank you
Been
for
a
being
joy to
with
be
us
with you.
on Reflections, and we do hope you'll be back with us again. We thank you for your support of the Paducah Cooperative Ministry, where all of us do God's work with human hands. Thank you.
Mission